Good evening. There are a lot of things that I really appreciate about the passage that we've just read together a moment ago in 2 Timothy chapter 2, and I think, of course, most of all, because of the real-life analogies that the Apostle Paul uses to liken unto what it means to be a Christian in the work, in the duty, and the responsibility that we have. And as we pay close attention to that reading, there are three analogies that Paul actually uses. And we know that he uses the analogy of the athlete, which happens to be one of the favorite analogies of Paul. He does this 3 or 4 times within his epistles, particularly in great length in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. But then there are various times that he speaks about the athlete that competes for the prize. The other analogy that is certainly rich and makes a lot of sense, particularly for that day, would be the analogy of the hard-working farmer, as we just read about. And when you think about society in that day, which was much more agrarian than societies are today in our world, though we very much depend upon agriculture. And as we were driving through the San Joaquin Valley, both on Friday and yesterday, as we'd gone over to a gospel meeting in Escalon near Modesto, we're always amazed as you drive through the valley, and if it's on the I-5, shooting on over to the 99 and a couple of cross highways that we went, of how dependent we are upon farming and agriculture. And as we're going through that, Vicki, and she makes this comment a lot, but we saw these men working and tractors going, and she says they are such hard-working people, and they are. And we depend upon that. We understand why Paul would use that analogy as well, because we see that, the great responsibility. But then certainly the third analogy, and it is the analogy that I want us to consider in tonight's lesson, Paul also talks about the soldier. And this also would be something that the people would be quite familiar with in their day. And even as we would look at the first century times and to the time of Roman civilization, and all countries and nations certainly had their armies and men that served in military service, but we can almost picture in our minds what would be a soldier, perhaps a century or a legion member within the Roman army. Paul will use that analogy even as we are to put on the whole armor of God that he talks about in Ephesians 6. We just sang a song a moment ago about soldiers of Christ arise, and in the one verse it speaks about the panoply of God. And panoply, of course, is just another word for armor, the type of armament that they would wear. And so it too is a very rich analogy because it comes with tremendous responsibilities. I was reading some time ago, and this originally goes back to an article that I had written for a bulletin back in the 1990s when we were still in Cayucas. And going back and looking at some of those bulletin articles that I had written, I take some of those and I put them to the side, and I think some of those points one day I'm going to get around to it and turn it into a sermon rather than just, a brief little article as we have the one short-paged article in the bulletin. And I remember reading some time ago, and this takes us back historically to World War I. In fact, in 1914, and a British officer by the name of Lord Horatio Kitchener, he was born in 1850. He died in 1916, by the way, as his ship, and he's aboard a ship that were over 600 men were lost at sea, sadly. But in 1914, Lord Horatio Kitchener, in a message to the soldiers of the British expeditionary, I knew I'd get it out, expeditionary force said, and I want you to listen very carefully to this quotation, because I think that it is just rich, it is masterful and challenging to the forces to whom he said this. As they were getting ready, these British soldiers, to go, of course, into places like France particularly, and to be involved in incredible warfare, trench warfare. He says, "You are ordered abroad as a soldier of the King to help our French comrades against the invasion of a common enemy. You have to perform a task which you will need courage, your energy, your patience. Remember that the honor of the British Army depends on your individual conduct. It will be your duty not only to set an example of discipline and perfect steadiness under fire, but also to maintain the most friendly relations with those whom you are helping in this struggle. As I had thought about that quotation, and for us that know a little bit about the history, and there's none of us that are old enough here, to say, oh, I remember World War I. And I'm not even going to pick on any of you at all. There's none of us that are old enough to remember that. And Earl is over there shaking his head. It's in appreciation. But as we would look back, because this was a war that was fought and completed before anyone here was born. And when you think about that, I find that interesting because World War I is getting to be more and more distant history in this nation. There are no more survivors, by the way, of World War I. I remember being in the airport in Augusta, Georgia here just a couple of years ago. And while we were waiting for a flight and the news came on, in fact, it was at that time the last survivor of an American that actually was in battle in World War I had died while we were there. And so it's a generation that has long since passed. There are beginning to be fewer and fewer veterans of World War II. And then I heard, by the way, in a newscast on the radio just 2 or 3 days ago, that we are losing somewhere between 700 and 1,000 Korean War veterans every day in our country. We're looking at that and to these men now that I think about when my father-in-law and Earl and Dale Friend and there are others of this congregation, these are individuals in their 80s, and we understand how this goes on. We must not lose sight of the fact of some of the history that's involved here. When Lord Kitchener would make this comment, when you understand the background and the history that preceded a number of decades, even a couple of centuries, that the English and the French many times were not allies. In fact, you can go back only a couple of centuries and understand that they were ardent enemies. And we see that, and it's interesting how things change and how politics and the circumstances change. But now here was a situation in which the French were being aggressively attacked by the German forces, and now the British have been called upon to go in to help them, and they are referred to now as comrades. And he is imploring these men that are going to go on foreign soil to protect people and to protect interests that really had little to do in some respects to their own personal lives. Now, we understand that in war we have to look at the bigger picture. This country itself was involved in World War I, and it was a good thing that it finally came to the aid of the assistance of that great war too. And we understand that how many young men did we have who remember even the song Over There, which was written during World War I, that went over there. And people that had no idea of the politics, no idea of what was going on in the world affairs, but now that they are fighting in battles. We can say the same thing about World War II in the bigger picture because of the Axis nations. We could say the same thing about what went on with the Korean War, the Korean conflict, and what was going on with China and with communism, now with North Korea and all of that. And we look at the bigger picture and we understand that there's a call to arms at times for people to defend right and what seems to be the greater cause. There are always going to be those that will say, even as there were in the early 1900s, said America had no business being involved in that war. You have the same kind of dissenters that said Americans have no business being in World War II, and every time it goes. And I understand. I'm not saying I agree, but I understand. But now we're talking about, and when we think about the words that what Lord Kitchener said to these individuals, and I believe that it may be one of the finest definitions or descriptions of a soldier's duty in military life. A soldier is to be courageous, enthusiastic, patient, disciplined, and needs to be exemplary in conduct. And those are the points we're going to look at, because this is what he was calling these men to do. But you know what? That's very biblical when we talk about the spiritual war in which we are engaged. Soldiers of Christ, arise. And then we have to take those same kind of qualities and apply them to our lives. And every one of us as Christians, we understand within the metaphor that is used, we are to be soldiers of Christ. And that Jesus Christ is our captain, if you will. That he is our commander-in-chief. He is the one that is leading us in battle, and we understand and recognize that the greatest foe that could be faced is the foe that we face. And that is Satan himself. And he has his own kind of arsenal, his weapons. And what are we going to do, and what is it going to take in order to succeed, in order for us to achieve the victory? You know, as we've been talking about in the Sunday morning class for the last few weeks, regardless of one's view of the book of Revelation, or even of one's view very specifically of 2 Thessalonians 2, where our discussion has been, this much we know, that when we remain faithful in Christ, when we, as we've also sung this evening, stand up for Jesus, and he is our Lord indeed, when we remember that and we remain faithful, we will be victorious. Make no mistake about that. Will there be casualties along the way? Without question. Will there be hardships, difficulties, and challenges? And situations in which are uncomfortable? Yes. Because when we look at our role and our duty as Christians, and there are a lot of songs that we could have sung, Onward Christian Soldiers. When we look at those kinds of songs that are given, have been written to rally the spiritual troops, to strengthen our hearts, to remind us of our cause, it is a constant reminder that living the Christian life was never intended to be an easy life. And a lot of people have misunderstood that. Now, we are blessed. We are blessed, aren't we? We're filled with blessings. We are very privileged people. And I hope that all of us will look at it because of our relationship with God through Christ, and that who we are and what we are doing. I hope that every one of us will look at it and say, I would not trade my life with anyone because of our relationship with God. Now, maybe there's some things in your life that you would like to have done differently, or maybe there's some things that you wish could be improved upon. I don't know, and that's a very personal, subjective thing. But when it comes to being a Christian and a member of Christ's body, which means we are a part of his forces, a part of his spiritual legion, this is something that we should appreciate and respect so much that we look at it and say, I would not trade this for anything else. My appreciation for people in the military is second to none. I never served. In fact, if there was a regret in my life, I've thought about this, if there's a regret in my life, I look back and think sometimes I wish that maybe I would have served in the military just for a little bit to say that I did it for my country. But time and circumstances were different and I did not. It's nothing, I don't lose any sleep about it, I'll tell you. But I have great appreciation for those that do. But inasmuch as I have great appreciation, even as I wear this pen. This pen that has the Air Force insignia on it because of our son-in-law, and as Vicki was given one, this is actually Vicki's because mine got lost, but is something in our appreciation for what Luke has done and so forth. And while I have tremendous appreciation for what he and others have done, my appreciation for people that are soldiers of Jesus Christ is so much it's greater. To think that we are involved in the greatest adventure, which involves some battles and some challenges. And so in the frequently used analogies that Paul did to illustrate the Christian's duty within the kingdom of Christ, it is here that we talk about basic training. Basic training. My dad did basic training in the summertime of 1944 at Camp Roberts outside of Paso Robles. In the summertime, by the way. And I just remember him talking about how miserable it was from the standpoint of going out there. And evidently you do a lot of marching in basic training, Earl. I've heard Earl speak of it too. But I can just think of the marching that he talked about that he did in the summertime at Camp Roberts. And many of you that have served in military know what that's all about, and basic training and learning discipline and taking orders and getting in condition and all those kinds of things. I have just 5 simple points that I already alluded to just a moment ago that I want to make with you this evening that really deal with the soldier of Christ. And we understand why Paul then uses this analogy, these illustrations. And the very first thing that the soldier of Christ is to be courageous. Courage. It takes courage to be a Christian, to be a soldier of Christ. Courage, in reality, is a rare quality. For those individuals of valor that have exercised incredible courage in difficult circumstances, we make mention of them, we award them, we may pin a medal upon their chest, and sometimes it's done posthumously as well. And we think about the great courage that these individuals had to put themselves in the situations and just to rise up. I don't know, many of you probably have been to Arlington Cemetery before, outside of Washington, D.C. And it is a very, very almost awe-inspiring circumstance to see marker after marker after marker of these individuals. And that's just one cemetery. There are many cemeteries like that all over this country and even on some of our foreign fields. But these were individuals of great courage. Paul gives good advice. He gave good advice to the soldier of the Lord, the soldier of Christ, when he says to be on your guard and to stand firm. To be men of courage, be strong. And you find that in 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 13. And I want you to listen again. Be on your guard. Stand firm in the faith. Be men of courage. Be strong. And all Christians, men and women, are to be people of courage and are to be strong. Watching, standing, and staying all take courage. And the mental toughness to stand in the face of adversity and danger. It takes courage to be a soldier of Christ, not fair-weathered Christians. You see, being a soldier of Christ may seem quite simple and easy when things are going well. Maybe when the church is at peace and things are good at home and things are good in our lives. But you often wonder about those that will stand up, those that will be firm in the faith and will be courageous when there are great things threatening our lives spiritually and threatening the congregation. And there are a lot of teachings and there are a lot of influences in our world today that soldiers of Christ need to arise and to take that stand and take courage and not to be afraid to be the voice God wants us to be. The soldier of Christ must be courageous, be people of great courage. It is my hope and prayer that our congregation would never become infected by apathy, by compromise, or by a lack of just overall interest in what's right. Courageous people are not going to do that. And when the going does get tough, courageous people are going to stand up, and not only that, they're going to make sure that they are where they need to be. You know, occasionally problems can exist. Even as we talked about in this morning's lesson, problems can exist in relationships. If a problem exists in the relationship of the marriage, is our attitude to be that, just forget about it. I don't want to be in this relationship anymore, and we would just scrap the marriage. Society looks at it that way a lot, doesn't it? Happens all the time. I'm here to say to you that even when there are problems, and being in the kingdom of Christ, there are going to be difficulties from time to time. But when we decide that we don't want to be involved with that, or that we would just bail out, or that we're going to be what shall we say? AWOL? Absent without leave? The courageous individual will not do that. We need each other, brethren. We truly, truly do. The soldier of Christ is to be courageous. The soldier of Christ is to be enthusiastic. Don't you think? They tried to breed enthusiasm. I thought a lot about this, and I've heard individuals, especially some of the older, wiser sages, as they say, that the optimum age is probably that right around that 17, 18, 19-year-old young man, because you're going to take him and you're going to train him, and then you're going to say, go get him. And you get married and you have your wife and you have your children, and all of a sudden you're in. 30 years old is not very old, right? But even in the military, if you're an 18, 19-year-old soldier and there is a 30-year-old commanding officer you're dealing with, you know what he's called? The old man. I've heard this from my father, my father-in-law, and many others that were in the military, and they talked about, the old man, and when you go back and think about it, the old man was, in his 30s. I'm here to tell you, a man in his 30s is not an old man, right? It's very relative. But what happens is that you take this youth and you want to take this enthusiasm. And you want to use this enthusiasm in a very positive way to put them in these situations, and so they can enthusiastically take care of the business that needs to be taken care of. Pete Regan here not too long ago had me read a couple of books that he graciously provided for me online. One, The Virtue of War, which is a fictional biography about Alexander the Great. Oh, what a read. It is very, very, very good. But as I read that book, and I've read some other books very much like that, I'll tell you one thing that becomes very clear. Even Alexander the Great, and he was a military genius and so far ahead of his time, and by the way, he was 33 years old when he died, and basically, ostensibly, had conquered the world. But you look, and one of the things that they had to do is they had to, and he was a master at this, of emotionally charging his soldiers. Because soldiers and armies that lack enthusiasm lose. When they finally met the Persian forces, they were outnumbered incredibly. The Persian army had a standing army of 1 million men. But I'll tell you what, it was strategy, or as President Bush used to call it, strategery. But it was strategy. It was careful planning. But what it was, too, it was an enthusiasm And he always had to make sure that his ranks, that they were ready, that they were enthusiastic, that this is a cause that needs to be made. And this is something that we can do. And I kind of relate to that. Even though I was in the military, you do a lot of that in athletics as well. Especially when the coaches know that you're going up against a team that is bigger than you are, than faster than you are. They've got a good record. And what you don't say is, well, boys, I don't know what we're going to do this week because they're faster and they're bigger and they haven't lost a game. So good luck. Well, you may not even go out on the field. And you've heard me use old Sam Boyd's quotation. I'll never forget it when I was just a kid, 16 years old. And he finally told the team, he says, boys, he says, we may be small, but we're slow. But what we really did is we got involved, as we'll talk about as well, in discipline. But being enthusiastic, this is something that we can do. The good soldier believes in the cause for which he fights. What better cause than the cause of Jesus Christ? It is the superior cause because we are involved in a noble conflict. And so Paul says of soldiering. For example, in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12, as you see in the outline, for this reason I also suffer these things, nevertheless I'm not ashamed. For I know whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep what I have committed to him until that day. Paul knew that it was a noble cause. He was not going to lay down his sword, the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. And by the way, look at that text again. 2 Timothy. Where was Paul? In his final imprisonment, and would be decapitated in a matter of months. You see, he understood how important the cause was, and he never lost his enthusiasm. Brethren, I may say to you that there are times that even as we get older and even as we advance in our years in our life, and perhaps we retire from our job, and we see, and there are things, yes, that we slow down and things change in our life. That's just very natural too. But you know what? May we never retire from our enthusiasm of being Christians and doing what we can do for the cause of Christ. There are too many people that lose the passion, lose the enthusiasm. And for various reasons, because of hardships, because of just difficulties in life. The soldier of Christ is to be enthusiastic. Now with all of this, because of the hardships, I suggest to you as well that even as we saw in the words of Lord Kitchener, that the soldier of Christ is to be patient. The good soldier must persevere. And perseverance takes lots of patience. He must have so prepared himself that no danger is too great, no hardship is too harsh to push him away from his abiding confidence in Christ's cause. So intense are his feelings of confidence that he will suffer willingly. The view of the reward being always before his face. A few of us in this area knew a gentleman who passed on just a few years ago by the name of Randall Harris. Tim and I actually went to school with Randall's son, Randy, graduated from the same class 73 at Moore Bay High School. Randall Harris, who devoted his life to the education of mentally handicapped people, had a lot to do with the Chris Jefferson work in San Luis Obispo and in this county. My brother and I had served as counselors many years ago in some special camps that he would have in the county. Incredible individual, a man that was a chronic stutterer as a young man, very, very small in stature. When he went into the military during World War II, I believe that he weighed about 140 pounds. But he was selected and became one of the original Darby's Rangers. Now, you've probably heard of the Rangers now within the Army, but the original were the Darby's Rangers. And one of their first assignments was to go to North Africa, World War II, and and by the way, not Romney, but Rommel, but when General Rommel was, for the German army and forces, was just going across North Africa and getting ready to go across the Mediterranean, of course, to go into Europe itself. But the Darby's Rangers had many of their first assignments there. Randall Harris was an incredible man. And he was a man, though, not only was a man of courage and had learned what enthusiasm was all about, but he's a man of great patience. And I'd heard some of his stories. In fact, they had featured him on, if you remember the old Ralph Edwards show, This Is Your Life. Remember that? And I've seen that episode of his a couple of times, that he had received Purple Hearts with triple clusters, the Congressional Medal of Honor, the Silver Star, and was the second most, probably, that what I understand, was perhaps the second most decorated soldier in World War II, only behind Audie Murphy. Thank you. Audie Murphy, whose gravesite we saw at, by the way, at Arlington. Because right behind Audie Murphy, what's his first name again? Audie. And it was a little different. Audie Murphy, right behind his grave was another grave that bore the name Willey, W-I-L-L-E-Y, no relation, I'm sure, but I remember that. Randall Harris, incredible stories, but I'd never seen a man with such patience. And when you think about that, what he devoted his life to and what he did, it just was a part of his character, his makeup. But I know that in the situations that he found himself in, and they were harrowing situations, he did what he did because he understood the nobility, the cause of which he fought. We are to be patient. The battle will be difficult, but we need to be patient. We need to be prepared. The Apostle Paul put it this way in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 17. And I'm amazed by this because think of Paul, again, what he did, what he experienced, and he says, for our light affliction. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, is working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. I'm sorry, when I study the life of the Apostle Paul and look at Scripture, I have a difficult time saying that what Paul did and what Paul went through as a Christian was light affliction. I think mostly what we go through as Christians today could be better viewed as light affliction compared to what Paul went through. But you know what? Because it's an attitude. And again, no situation was too harsh for him. He understood what he was doing. And he was patient because he knew this. He says, for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. And if we truly believe that beyond this life, beyond the grave of this life, there is an eternal reward, then is not the cause the most noble cause there is. It truly is. Paul was willing to be a living sacrifice, as he called Christians to do in Romans 12:1. I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, wholly acceptable unto God, which is your reasonable service. Being a soldier of Christ is our reasonable service. So yes, it takes courage, it takes enthusiasm, and it takes patience. Now, without question, the soldier of Christ is to be disciplined. Absolutely disciplined. In reality, the physical warfare, no war can be won by flabby and unkempt ragtag soldiers. We know that. And I'll tell you, the military knows that. And they ought to know that. There must be sharpness, crispness, and complete order. And the fulfilling of command without question. Now, hindsight being what it is, We may look back and sometimes question wars and conflicts. You may have your opinion about Vietnam. You may have your opinion about the Gulf War back in the early 1990s, or about Iraq, or about Afghanistan. There are a lot of these things of which in hindsight we look back. But what has to happen that in the given time, that when soldiers are called upon and they are trained, they have to be trained with such discipline that they don't question orders, they just do. Because if you don't, the military is not going to succeed. Now I want to tell you that while we may question wars that have existed, and most wars ought to be questioned, they cost lives and otherwise are expensive. But one thing that we better not question is the war that we've got to be involved in. Because Satan isn't going away. He's not folding up his tent and saying, well, I'm done with this. He's going to continue to rage on as long as people are on this earth. And the soldier of Christ thereby needs to be disciplined. Here within the reading we had earlier in 2 Timothy 2, but now in verses 3 and 4, you therefore must endure hardship as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. No one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. Back to Alexander the Great. There were various times as they were marching on and going more and more east and east and east to what would be even the Far East, what we call the Orient today. And you have to recognize and understand that he had soldiers, these were men that had not seen their families for years, many years. And they had to keep getting their minds back on track, because when they allowed their minds to go back to remembering that they had wives and children and family and other interests, you know what happens is that becomes dangerous. And there were a couple situations where he even said, then fine, what you need to do is go home. Because you know what it becomes? If you become double-minded, it becomes dangerous for others. Do we see that? Brethren, it's where we need to be careful that we're not double-minded. That we need to keep our sights set where they need to be set. And this takes discipline for sharpness and readiness at all times, because of the foe that we face. Are we willing to be disciplined soldiers of Christ? Disciplined day in and day out, week after week, throughout our lives. Why we're here, why we're doing what we're doing, why we're involved not just a couple of days a week, but why we're involved Christians daily. Ever looking out what needs to be done and what needs to be defended and what needs to be combated. It takes discipline. Well, the soldier of Christ is to be an example. To have an exemplary, to lead an exemplary life. As the passage we just alluded to, or read just a couple of moments ago, particularly in verse 4, that no one engaged in warfare entangles himself with the affairs of this life, that he may please him who enlisted him as a soldier. And I want to ask, who enlisted us? Christ did. And as that passage states, the good soldier is separated from civilian affairs. He must show those round, well, all the people around him, his courage, his enthusiasm, yes, his patience, and his discipline. But his dedication, and that he again is waged within a noble conflict, and kept the calling. And to do so because he wants to be a good example of soldiering to others. Paul himself led that kind of exemplary life, no doubt. And he wanted other Christians to do the same. And we see, like in passages such as Philippians 3:17, when he says, brethren, join in following my example, and note those who so walk as you have us for a pattern. His example is worth following. And we should desire to imitate Paul's life even as he imitated Christ. 1 Corinthians 11:1. Be imitators of me even as I am of Christ. Because when all is said and done, whose steps are we to follow? follow the steps of Christ. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 21. Well, when we think of all this and the value of basic training, that the soldier of Christ that is going to be courageous, enthusiastic, patient, disciplined, and an example, what is it that the soldier of Christ longs for? And I say to you in conclusion that he longs for the crown of righteousness. Paul says, henceforth, in 2 Timothy 4 and verse 8, henceforth there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give to me, and not to me only, but unto all them also who love his appearing. Again, we award sometimes soldiers with medals and ribbons, but they shall all fade, and many of these soldiers are soon forgotten. But Christ will never forget. And you know what we want, what we need, what we long for is the crown of righteousness. To be victorious with Jesus Christ. These are good analogies Paul gives because people can relate to them. But what I hope that it does is that it stirs within us, or at least serves as a reminder to us that, brethren, what we are doing week in and week out, we must never lose sight of who we are and what we're doing. I want to close with this. Because is there not sometimes a tendency and even a temptation to allow boredom and tedium, and just as life goes on, a lack of enthusiasm, and say, you know what? It's just not as important to me as it once had been. And you see this with Christians that grow tired. And all I can say to those Christians that are growing tired is, soldier of Christ, arise. We're going to sing a song of invitation. Dare to stand like Joshua. Right? That's another sermon. But what a great example that is. If we can help you in your spiritual need, and if you need to be revitalized, whatever your spiritual need may be, dare to stand. We can help you. Won't you come for this time as we stand and sing this song that has been